welcome to your first video in Heterodox Economics. I'm Alyssa Schneebaum.
And I'm Hendrik Theine.
And we're trying something new in this class. We're doing videos for you, the students in both of our classes, where we are going to talk through the material that we want you to know, but instead of doing a lecture, we're going to do it in conversation with each other.
The idea is that this should serve as a basis for the classes, for the sessions, and to get a debate going, and also to have an input for you, which is maybe a bit different than usually because we discussed it, the two of us.
We know you have a lot of videos to watch, and we know you're spending a lot of time in front of your computer. We know you're missing social context, and so we really want to use the time that we have in class to actually interact with you.
Maybe before we start, I mean, it's on Learn already, and we'll also send out an email beforehand, but it's really important for you to get this Routledge book, Rethinking Economics, right? This is, we will communicate it via different channels as well, but here again, we need this book because it's really the basis for us to work with for the different schools of heterodox economics that we'll go into detail with. So really get the book, it's important. We need it, you need it. It's important to read. Yeah, and it's also a great book, so.
It is a good book. We don't love the idea of making you sort of buy something. The book is, I think, 22 euros or something like that. So not crazy, like probably some of your books in some of your other classes. But if that's a problem, definitely talk to us and we will find a solution for you.
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about what is heterodox economics. Some of you have probably heard of heterodox economics and some of you haven't heard of it. So we need to sort of lay the groundwork. What is it? How does it compare to mainstream economics? And how does it compare to neoclassical economics? What do these words even mean? What are these things? And in order to understand that, we have to see the economics discipline as comprising different schools of thought. So economics, there isn't just one economics, but there's economics with different ways of understanding economics, ways of understanding economic processes and economic outcomes. If you watch the other videos that we are asking you to watch for this week, featuring Hajun Chang, you'll see that there are different ways of thinking about economic issues, and one way is the so-called mainstream. That's the stuff that's out there in the top-rated journals. That's a lot of what you're being taught in other classes. That's what people think of when they think of economics these days. But there's always been, for a very long time at least, sort of dissenting opinions, dissenting ways of seeing economics, and that is heterodox economics. And that's what we will be teaching and working with you on to understand in this class.
I mean, economics, as Alyssa said, we have a lot of different schools of thought. We have a lot of different perspectives. And in the end, and this is maybe also a bit of a disclaimer, in the end, it's also very complex, right? So there are many, many people at the same time working on different ends of different parts of economics, being really specialized into really specialized problems or methods or ideas and perspectives. And so what we try to do is really to give an overview, but we can't have all the details of all the different people working in this complex field. So it's a bit of a general view, and it's based on papers, on other people trying to understand this economic science. And we read those papers and trying to, through their lenses, trying to understand what economics is about in the different schools. But really, it's also just an overview. So yeah, if you go into details, it's maybe a bit different, or people try to combine perspectives, or it's just a disclaimer that things are quite complex around economics.
So we're going to talk about that today. And that's also what the discussion and class will be about in our first class meeting. The following 5 class meetings will be focused on each one different school of economic thought, which broadly fits into the umbrella of heterodox economics. So these 5 schools of thought are Marxian economics, institutional economics, feminist economics, post-Keynesian economics, and ecological economics. And these are vibrant, interesting, important schools of economic thought, which are all outside of the mainstream of economics. And they're all considered some variation of heterodox economics. And so that's the idea. We go in detail about those schools of thought in the remaining 5 weeks of the class. But in this first week, the goal for today and in the first day of class is to really give an overview. What is this thing called heterodox economics? How does it compare to mainstream economics?
Okay. So, I mean, many of you know from your bachelor studies and also maybe from the beginning of the master studies, this school called, or the different variations of neoclassical economics.
In the history of economic thought, and economics has been around for literally centuries, neoclassical economics has been sort of the mainstream, the main idea in economics since about the 1960s. It's still a lot of what's being taught, but that's changing.
So 3 really important characteristics of neoclassical economics are constraint optimization. Then we have individuals maximizing their preferences. And then we have this idea of analyzing equilibria.
So you know all of these things. You've done this in your classes. This has been the basis of your classes. You maximize utility subject to constraints, to maybe income constraints.
And what comes out of it, if these are the core characteristics, right? It's really this idea of analyzing the economy from an individualist methodology, from an individualist perspective, right? Because you try to break down all the different problems within the economy, within economics, try to break it down to individuals maximizing preferences. This could be households or firms, right? You know this from typical microeconomic classes. And this idea of trying to analyze equilibria, but really also not only with a focus on individual problems, individual choice problems. We have this idea of also in the macroeconomic classes, we had this idea of trying to break it down to the individuals, right? So a lot of the growth model, for example, try to break down problems of economic growth to individuals maximizing their preferences to certain household decision-making and to certain firm decision-making, right? And this is the idea of an individualist methodology, meaning that many or even all of the problems in economics can be explained by breaking them down to the individual level. This is really important because this is a very important characteristic, maybe a 4th one then, of neoclassical economics. And it really comes out of those first 3 characteristics in a way.
Another interesting characteristic of neoclassical economics, which is kind of a good bridge also to today's mainstream economics, is that a lot of neoclassical economics is very full of math. It's a lot of mathematical modeling. You all know this from your classes, right? You do a lot of math, there's a lot of equations, there are a lot of graphs. That wasn't the case until neoclassical economics sort of became the big thing in economics. And that is how economics, when neoclassical economics was kind of the king, I gendered that. You'll learn about why in the week on feminist economics. When neoclassical economics was kind of the king in economics, everything in economics everything in the mainstream of economics became very math.
So it was different before. So for example, if you read up on some of the classics, I don't know, Schumpeter, for example, or maybe also Keynes, or other people writing in this period before the 1960s, right? In this period before, there is some math in the classics, but it's really maybe to prove an analytical point, or maybe to make an argument that where you feel for some reason math is needed, right? Also, econometric comes up slowly, but really it's not the center, it's not the focus, and it's not the only way to argue in an economic way, right? There was already a camp or some people strongly arguing in this direction, but they weren't the only ones, and was quite a maybe pluralist or diverse economics in terms of whether or not to use math as the only tool to understand economic problems.
So in order do all this mathy stuff. And in order to have these economic models, a very important assumption in neoclassical economics was that agents or people were very rational and didn't have a lot of uncertainty. They had full information, they knew everything that was going on, and they made, the right decision given their constraints and their circumstances. And that was very heavily criticized left and right from many, many different schools of thought. And it's also part of, because that's so far from reality, it is also part of why the mainstream has shifted and moved more away from that assumption, especially behavioral economics, which does a lot of experiments with people kind of in laboratories, and it's in a lot of ways very related to psychology, has shown people are not rational. And we see that again and again in these experiments. And so economics has sort of had no choice but to move away from this assumption of perfect rationality.
A bit of a different question is whether you actually have preferences, or what those preferences are and how they constitute, how they come to life, all those things, right? And here I think the mainstream also went far beyond this really neoclassical characteristic of we have stable preferences and they're just there, right? And you reveal them by buying something. So here the mainstream went quite a long way of also looking into statistics, looking into surveys, asking people, hey, so what do you want? What are your preferences? So there's rich literature on beliefs, on preferences, on how they change, what they're influenced by, how you also get, all those things around preferences. Is really rich literature, which went far beyond the beginning, the neoclassical argument.
Yeah. And when we think about the mainstream today, and to talk about what the mainstream is today is a little bit difficult because it's a living reality, right? It's changing all the time. It sort of depends on what papers are being published and what talks are being given at the main conferences and so on. But we looked at the literature and we've talked about it a lot, and we think that we could really classify the mainstream today as characterized by empiricism. So less of a reliance on analytical models, but more, everything data-based, everything based on big data sets, especially register data, big data, you've all heard those terms, and everything these days has to be empirical with those kind of data sets.
To make it a bit stronger, by empirical, we mean quantitative empirical analysis.
There are some other characteristics that, some people say are still important for the mainstream today. The analysis of equilibria is maybe still important. Certain kinds of uncertainty are important in a lot of these analyses. Individualist methodology is important in some ways of thinking about today's mainstream. There's a lot of discussion about those last three things, but really the main takeaway, I think, what almost everybody would agree upon in economics is that economics has become very empirical and empiricist.
Almost entirely left out is qualitative research, right? And this is important. So maybe asking people in interviews and really going into depth what they think about certain things, but not interview 1,000 people, but just 5 or 10 or 15 and go really into depth what they think. So maybe interviews is one example. Another one would be ethnographically field surveys. You just go to the bakery and see the people interact and try to come up with an understanding of why people interact in this way in this standard economic situation. You just don't do this in the standard economic mainstream analysis because, well, it's not really about data.
Yeah, exactly. Or you have a case study, or you have a theory of, bakers produce so much because whatever reasons you think based on your theory, and then you take a bakery and you kind of interact with the people in that bakery, with the bakers, you talk to the owners, you talk to the customers, and you really go in depth to understand what's going on at that bakery. So that's a case study to understand the production decisions, the consumption decisions, and so on.
This is usually not classified as the standard quantitative economic method of analyzing empirical data.
Yeah,
which is, at least from my perspective, quite a pity, because it's also a very nice tool to understand the economic reality outside. So for new and upcoming maybe trends or things that emerge, that evolve within the economy, for those things where you don't have a lot of data, which is just not maybe an established perspective, or just something that comes up, right, as out of a niche or something like this. So all those things, all those new things, new developments, those are really nice to analyze with qualitative research. So for example, I don't know, somebody inventing something and it's just not a big trend, it's just a niche. For those things, it really makes sense to go in there, to have a really depth understanding, analyze those people, analyze this niche, and then come up with why this is new, why this is important, why this even exists. For those kind of things, qualitative research makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and there are many more arguments, but this is, I think, from my perspective, one that is really important.
And this is a nice gateway. This sort of takes us into what we think heterodox economics is. If mainstream economics these days is very empiricist with a focus on quantitative data analysis, what does heterodox economics say? And I want to qualify this by saying, we sort of hinted at the fact that there are many different schools of thought within heterodox economics. So we try to find some commonality among them. What do these different schools of thought in the umbrella of heterodox economics have in common? And just as a hint or a tip for what we're going to be doing for the rest of the semester is that every time we look at a different school of economic thought, we'll be looking and saying, okay, well, how do we characterize this school of economic thought? What are the main characteristics? And how does that relate to the overall things that we come up with for heterodox economics, and how does that relate to what we've come up with for mainstream economics?
Mm-hmm. One definition to start with that is quite common within heterodox economics is basically to say there is no common positive definition. What does it mean? It means we have those different schools within heterodox economics, and they are in this from this argument they're very different actually. But their commonality is they all share a criticism of the mainstream. So they criticize different parts of the mainstream, but the commonality is really this, we all have something to criticize about the standard way of doing economics.
That's true. The way that Hendrik just talked about it is often considered a so-called negative definition of heterodox economics, because it basically says heterodox economics is the criticism of mainstream economics. But we also looked into the literature and we found at least 3 things that we think can define heterodox economics on its own, unrelated to mainstream economics. So on its own, we would say that 3 core characteristics of heterodox economics is 1, that heterodox economics takes a so-called open system approach. 2, that heterodox economics, all schools of thought in heterodox economics are in favor of a more diverse methodology. And 3, that there are more clear ontological foundations in heterodox schools of thought.
Maybe to start with, I think it was the second one, the methodology. It's something we already discussed a bit, but really to underline it again, the argument here, the core argument here is we can and we should do empirical analysis. It's an important part of what we do within economics, but it should be broad. And there is no one way of doing a very good empirical study, but there are very different ways of doing good economics, right? Empirical economics. So you could use qualitative research methods, you could use quantitative research methods, you could combine them in a mixed methods way, you could focus on one, you could try to combine 2, 3, 4, 5. All those different ways of doing different empirical analysis is really an important part of heterodox economics. and really also this understanding of maybe I'm a heterodox researcher in this way, and I usually use those three methods, but I know this person here uses different methods. She has really good arguments for that, and I try to understand why she uses those methods and why I use my methods, and maybe we can combine them or something like this. So really this openness of the world is actually quite complex, and economics is really complex, and it's not clear which method is the best one to understand that, right?
And this issue of sort of openness towards methodology relates really closely to the idea of this open system approach. To understand this, I think the best thing is to read a quote for you from Dow. The quotation is, "An open system approach sees the subject matter evolving such that not all relevant variables and relationships are knowable. Knowledge is thus built up by means of partial systems using methods which are not commensurate enough for representation by means of a formal mathematical system." Right, so really the idea is that there are things going on in the economy that we can't express mathematically.
So kind of this open system approach kind of entails that usually there are very rich models of the individual, of the different actors within the economy in heterodox economics.
And the last thing that we want to say about heterodox economics, the last kind of core feature, is this real important grounding in the ontological understanding of economics. So this is really the question of what do economists and economic analyses really assume about what is, right? That is ontology. What is? And heterodox economists are really the group of economists that tend to focus more on the role of and the importance and centrality of history, of institutions, of social structures, of power, in these things, really emphasizing what is. Like, the economy doesn't exist outside of those things, right? There are power relations in the economy. There are important institutions like racism, like norms about how people should behave. These things exist, impact economic relationships and outcomes, and help us understand how to think about what the economy is. What is the economy?
Yep. There are entire papers then thinking about what's actually the relationship between, for example, racism and the economy. In practice, this really means that heterodox economists spend time on thinking about definitions, or maybe just write an entire paper on, hey, I thought about this definition, let's rethink it a bit, because I looked at the literature and, hey, I think it doesn't really make sense, or it doesn't cover maybe new upcoming features or something like this.
And I think that's a great way of saying that this is something that we think that heterodox economics does better than mainstream economics, that we have a lot more realism in our understanding of the economy when we think about the economy from a heterodox point of view. It's much more about reality. It's much more about the complex ways in which people interact, in which institutions interact, in which, you know, the fact that you have whatever 10 euros in your pocket, how did that 10 euros get there? Why is it only 10 euros? How did the euro system develop? Right? There's a lot of stuff at play. What kind of pocket do you have? Where'd you get your pants? All these different complex issues that are, in the end, very much economic issues, can be in many ways better understood through the complexity of heterodox economics. Other things that heterodox economics kind of do better in helping us understand how the economy works. Heterodox economics is more prone to looking at issues that are typically underrepresented in mainstream economics. So heterodox economics is more likely to look at power relations, for example. And as I've said, institutions. You know, a lot of people think about institutions as the World Bank or the European Commission or something like that, and those are institutions. But when we think about institutions in heterodox economics and in institutional economics, we also think about institutions broadly defined, namely the interactions between people and organizations that influence the way that we do economics. So norms, rules, laws, these are all institutions.
And maybe to pick up on that one, because we talked before about the methodological individualism, there is analysis of individuals, of individual decision-making, of individual interactions, but in heterodox economics, many of the people working within this field and also many of the schools of thought would argue you can't understand the economy only from an individualist perspective. And some go as far as to say you don't actually need to look at the individual to understand the economy. You need to look at the macro level solely. So this is, and some would say, hey, you shouldn't only look at the macro level, but also understand the diverse levels, so micro, meso, macro, and understand that there are different levels. But really, there's a large debate around, and really some people going as far as to say, you don't have to look at the individual. It's much more important to look at the system, to look at the rules of the game, to look at the way the economy is structured, and then we implicitly understand many of the decisions of the individual, because in the end, they're not really individual decisions, but really guided by institutions, as Alyssa said before, or the way we're taught to think in education, or the way we're kind of also a bit forced to act in the market system, because, for example, as somebody only having the labor force, we have to go to the market, and we're kind of restrained by many of the things that the labor market is set up in the way we currently live in. So many of those system level characteristics actually define or very much influence the way individuals work and individuals decide and individuals do things. So really here the argument is methodological individualism looking only at the individual kind of fails to understand many of the ways the economy works.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things that comes up in a lot of heterodox economics, and the last point that we'll make about what heterodox economics is that there's a lot more understanding of the ecology as a system and the importance of the ecology in economic relations. Without a healthy ecology, we don't have an economy, also because we don't have any people then. And what can be produced, what can be consumed, what can be done, given the constraints of our ecology.
That's also a really important thing. I mean, it's also something that is discussed within the mainstream, that can also be discussed from a really purely neoclassical point of view. But here the difference would be maybe many of the heterodox people would go also very much into the arguments of maybe climate system research, or into conservation biologists, or pick up their arguments of how nature actually works, and then try to build the economy around it, or understand the economy around it, and not maybe as in neoclassical economics would do that, try to understand the nature really just from a neoclassical point of view. So really just understand it as externalities, because that's the way we understand it in neoclassical economics. But really, heterodox people would go more into the arguments than from biology, from climate research, and really say, hey, you're the experts there, explain to me how this works, and I try to understand the economy in relation to that then.
Yep. So now you have a general understanding of heterodox economics in comparison to mainstream economics, and you also learned a little history of economic thought in understanding where do you put neoclassical economics in the grand scheme of economic thought over time. In class, when we discuss, we'll talk more about in detail about what this heterodox economics is, what mainstream economics is. But maybe it's also interesting for you to know now that one thing that we're going to ask you to do this semester is every time we talk about a different school of economic thought, we're going to ask you to consider how can you understand an important economic relation from the lens of this school of economic thought. Because these days economic inequality is very big. It's a big topic. A lot of people are interested in it. We're both very interested in it. Probably many of you are interested in it. We took that as the big thing to be talked about and analyzed throughout the semester. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to think about, when we take a school of economic thought, we'll ask you to say, okay, how might mainstream economics address the question of economic inequality, and how does this school of economic thought do it differently? How does it maybe do it better? How does it maybe do it worse? How does it help us understand this big important thing in the economy differently than what you would otherwise learn in mainstream textbooks or classes or papers?
Yep, and we hope it's you learn something. It's interesting, but also fun. But let's see.
I think it'll be fun. Fun for us.
Yeah, fun for us at least.
Okay, if you have any questions, of course, let us know, but also bring your questions to our first class meeting. That is where we will get to interact and talk with you about it, and looking forward to hearing your ideas about all of this stuff.
Yeah, and that would maybe mean if you watch this video once and maybe understood just 5% or something, maybe you need to watch it again and really put down your questions, your comments, and also, yeah, what you just didn't get, what was, yeah, maybe much too far, maybe way too, yeah, just not understandable for you, and then we discuss it in the class again. We won't watch this video again in class.
We'll help work through these ideas with you in class, but in a different way. And just to be totally clear, we don't expect you to get all of this stuff right away. That's why you're taking the class, right? Because you don't know all of this stuff, and you're here to learn it. And learning means that you don't get everything right away. So if some things didn't resonate or sink in or make sense, totally normal. Cool.
And ask questions.
Ask questions. That's your job.
Good.
Okay, see you soon.
Bye.